I'm here today in Concord, Massachusetts at the historic Old North Bridge, which commemorates the first day of battle in the American Revolution, where our founding fathers fought for our freedom. Our program today addresses another fight for freedom and how it was that one very special man, Mr. Steve Ross, managed to not only survive the extermination of 2/3 of the European Jewish population at that time, but refused to allow the experience of being incarcerated in 10 concentration camps over a 5-year period to have final say. A gutsy and courageous Steve Ross opted instead to spend the rest of his life working tirelessly to spread a message of hope and healing and remembrance in his newly adopted country, America. The fruits of his efforts culminated with his founding of the New England Holocaust Memorial in Boston, Massachusetts. Please join us today as we catch up with Emmy Award-winning filmmaker Roger Lyons, who will be discussing his latest film, Etched in Glass, The Legacy of Steve Ross. Before we meet up with Roger Lyons, we'd like to share some footage with you from our recent visit to the New England Holocaust Memorial in Boston. Located on the Freedom Trail, the memorial was founded by Steve Ross in tribute to the 6 million Jewish lives that were lost during the Holocaust. Each one of these glass towers you see here represents one of the 6 death camps of Nazi Germany. Please join us as Roger Lyons discusses his latest film, chronicling the inspirational life of the memorial's founder, Steve Ross. An accomplished writer, producer, and director for more than 30 years, Roger is a veteran of the New England television scene, following successful stints at WBZ, WSBK, WCVB, WGBH, Metro Media, WVIT, and WHDH, formerly WNEV. He founded his own production company, Many Hats Productions. Roger recently served as coordinating producer for the documentary entitled Digital Man, Digital Age, a film exploring the life and work of Digital Equipment Corporation founder Ken Olsen. Roger currently serves as National Trustee from the Boston, New England chapter of the National Academy of Television Arts and Sciences. In 2011, he was recipient of the prestigious Governor's Award for the Boston, New England chapter of that academy. Roger has also written 4 feature screenplays, receiving numerous industry awards, including honors from PBS, Promax BDA, and Imagine Magazine, among others. Please join us now as the Sunny Side has the pleasure of welcoming filmmaker Roger Lyons. We're really happy to have you here today on the program. Wanted to ask you, 15 years in the making. Wow, what a labor of love. Can you tell us how you first met Steve Ross and what inspired you to make this film?
Sure. I was actually working at WBZ, and I was producing some segments of profiles of people who had done extraordinary things in the community, and somebody recommended Steve Ross as somebody we should profile, and gave me some contact information, a little bit of a bio, and it looked interesting because he was a Holocaust survivor who was the founder of the New England Holocaust Memorial, big monuments in Boston, big glass towers with numbers etched in the glass and so forth. And he had a great story to tell. So I called him up and tried to arrange a shoot to do the video for the project. And 2 hours later, at the end of the phone call, he finally took a breath, and I made an appointment to go see him and do a shoot for this Hometown Heroes profile, which is what they called it. And so I met him at the Holocaust Memorial in downtown Boston. And within a minute, I realized there was more than a 1-minute film here. There was a whole story, a whole documentary that needed to be told. And so just listening to Steve and his story and how life during the Holocaust affected him and other people and so forth, it was something that just really grabbed me emotionally. And my also being Jewish had some factor into it, I'm sure. So I thought, well, I have to try to make a film of this. And so I've been working on it since the year 2000.
Wow. Can you tell us a little bit about Steve's early life in Poland as a youngster?
Sure. Life in Poland, he was with a large family. It was 6 children and 2 parents, and everything was kind of normal for a while. And they were poor, but his father was a butcher, and they got by. They were very religious, and things seemed to be normal for that time of the century, until the Nazis came and overran Poland And what ultimately happened was when the Nazis came in and tried to get all the Jews into a ghetto, his family tried to escape, but they dropped him off at a farm, a Christian farm, and they tried to save him by having him really in what they thought was a safe place. Yeah. But it didn't last long, and unfortunately, he was put in the woods to save himself and linked up with the partisans, but the Germans eventually caught him and learned that he really was Jewish, even though he had been learning all the Christian prayers and so forth. So what started out as a normal childhood ended up being, 5 years of concentration camps.
Well, I understand, too, he went through quite a bit of suffering. He suffered a beating at the hands of one of the guards that actually broke his back.
Right. There were a lot of incidents like that, but the particular one that you're mentioning was the fact that he stole a raw potato, and one of the guards discovered that he did this, and they beat him in the back with a lead pipe. And his back is still not right today. It's sort of a curvature of the spine or something. It's not really quite right, but that's the kind of thing that they did with the prisoners back in those days.
The film contains a lot of historical footage and a lot of war footage as well. There's one photograph that especially is meaningful, I believe, to Steve, because he carries the flag. It's a photograph of the American flag, and if I'm correct, he still has that flag with him to this very day. Can you tell us the significance of that American flag?
Sure. After his 5 years in 10 concentration camps, finally the war was winding down, and Dachau was liberated, the concentration camp in Dachau, Germany. And the American soldiers were coming by in a troop of tanks. And the tank commander saw the people wandering around. They were being released from the camps to go find hospitalization or refuge. And the tank commander saw this kid, Steve, who was a scrawny little kid, basically at the time, in his striped uniform. He had been, at the time, the tank commander, had been eating food with a knife out of a can, saw Steve, Shmulik at the time, his name was Shmulik Rosenthal. He jumped off the tank and gave Steve some of his food. Steve hadn't been fed in who knows how long, and he was full of lice and disease and everything, but he ate it all and so forth. And what happened was the tank commander, gave him not only the food, but he gave him a piece of cloth that he thought was just to wipe his face, the dirt and the tears off his face. And Steve didn't know what an American flag was. He was a Polish kid. But it was an American flag, and he kept it to this day, still has it, and he never goes anywhere without it. So that moment of kindness was the thing that was really the launching point for the rest of his life, really the catalyst.
Wow, it's amazing. The film does follow this transformation that happens within Steve, and you describe it as a transformation from a timid orphan to a gutsy street worker to a licensed psychologist. As a child, you further elaborate, Steve Ross suffered one of humanity's worst atrocities, yet he grew into a man who sees the best in people. How would you describe that transformation?
I think he always had kindness in his heart. And one of the things that really happened was he had battles with religion. And I'm going to go back even further than the Holocaust for a minute. But when the Nazis invaded Poland, the family, being very religious, went to the rabbi and said, "What should we do? What should we do?" And he was telling them to stay. Don't leave, stay. Things are going to be all right. And that kind of led to his incarceration for 5 years in 10 different camps. But he never lost hope. He kept God with him, even though for a while he lost that faith. And that's kind of what got him through. And then, of course, the moment of kindness where the U.S. soldier gave him his food and the flag rekindled that spirit, rekindled this hope that he had really been losing for a number of years, having suffered through years of torture, really. And so he carried that moment of kindness. He carried that forward and wanted to help other kids who've been really at-risk kids, not as at-risk as Steve in concentration camps necessarily, but kids who had been on the streets, who had been poor, facing poverty and abuse and so forth. So he dedicated his life to being able to help kids.
For most of the film, Steve is telling his story in his own words. What made you decide to produce the film in that manner?
I couldn't really find any way of telling it better than have Steve tell the story. as it turns out, now that he had a stroke and he's no longer able to really present himself on camera the way he did in the first 15 years I was working in this film. I have his son Mike telling the rest of his story, doing a little bit of voiceover and so forth, doing it a little more personally. But hearing Steve in action, talking to kids, talking to high schools, inner city high schools, there's no better way to hear the story than to have Steve tell it in his own words. He's very emotional, very energetic, and very genuine.
Well, I know that in viewing the film, the scenes where he's interacting with the students, they are so engaged. They physically move their bodies into him. They lean into him. Steve had a lifelong dream of meeting a certain person, and you arranged that. Can you tell us who that was and how it came to fruition?
Yeah, I didn't actually arrange it, but I was there when it happened. I told you a bit about the soldier who helped liberate Steve and gave him the flag and his food and so forth. And he, as I said earlier, he had that flag with him his whole life and still has it with him. And what he wanted to do was to find that soldier and thank him personally. And he gave speeches about it almost everywhere he went. He would hold up the flag and say, "This is what happened when I was liberated, and I want to meet the soldier to thank him, and he would be part of my family," and so forth. So he literally spent a large part of his adult life trying to find this American soldier. He joined VFWs and veterans organizations and so forth, did searches all over the place, and never found him until the family of the soldier, ended up finding Steve.
That's amazing.
It all encapsulated briefly. He did it. He was involved in a Unsolved Mysteries program. Remember the show back on NBC with Robert Stack and so forth? Well, Steve went on that show, and he was trying to find the soldier who liberated him. So they did a little recreation of what happened when the soldier gave him the food and everything and the flag. And the family of the soldier saw that show. I'm going to abbreviate the story for the sake of time. But ultimately, the granddaughter of the soldier located him on the internet and called him up. And turns out that it was the soldier, the actual soldier, and the family came and met Steve.
That's amazing. Amazing ending to that story. You know, you touched earlier upon the fact that many of Steve's jobs throughout his life had to do with working with youth and adolescents. Why do you think that was his choice?
I think he always wanted to give kids the breaks that he never had, to kind of teach them that the most important things are education, which is something that no one can take away from you, that builds you up and gives you options, gives you hope, and to just stay away from crime and so forth, stay in school. And he also facilitated getting some of them jobs so that they would take that education and put it towards something good to help them.
Tell us about a little bit of the cameos that happen in the film. There's a few notorious people that appear in the film. Can you tell us a little bit about who they are?
Well, some of the people that Steve encountered were folks like Ray Flynn, who was the former mayor of Boston and the former ambassador to the Vatican. He and Steve were street workers together in the urban inner city of Boston, Dorchester, South Boston, literally on the streets. And they worked together to keep kids in schools, keep them away from crime and so forth, and try to get them some jobs. And so years later, Steve connected with Ray Flynn as the mayor of Boston at the time when he wanted to find a place to put a memorial, a Holocaust memorial in the city of Boston. And Ray Flynn was the one who basically suggested putting it on the Freedom Trail, the famous Freedom Trail in Boston, the historic Freedom Trail. And who would have imagined that that would be the place? But they did. He gave them the land for a loan, like I think it's $1 a year, whatever it cost to lease the land. And it's between Boston City Hall and Faneuil Hall, the historic Faneuil Hall. It sits right there in the city of Boston. And the other two people you're referring to are people whom Steve saved from lives of crime. A guy named Steve Buckley, who was literally on the streets of South Boston and Dorchester with gangs. He was actually in a bar fight at one of Whitey Bulger's bars. He could have been killed at any time. And Steve actually got him out of jail and got him a job. And now he's a lawyer in the city of Boston. And the other guy was a guy named Charlie Titus, who was an African-American kid in the projects of Columbia Point, really awful place, full of crime and so forth. And Steve, one of the things that Steve did was he founded a basketball team that the kids all got together and played on. And that's where Charlie met Steve. And again, he helped keep Charlie off the streets and helped him find some focus in education. And now Charlie's vice chancellor at UMass Boston.
It's a wonderful ending to those stories. And so many years later that they still look back to him in fond remembrance of what he did for their lives.
And they're still
really.
in touch with Steve all these years later.
Of all his accomplishments, is there one that you think is most meaningful to Steve?
Well, I think a lot of people would say the memorial, the Holocaust Memorial, Lincoln Holocaust Memorial, and the film, the name of the film, Etched in Glass, the legacy of Steve Ross would say that. But in the film, Steve is actually interviewed by a kid at the Jeremiah Burke High School. And he's asked, what is your legacy? And he says his legacy is helping kids. The way he was able to keep kids in school, keep them off the streets and so forth, that he wants to be most remembered for that.
That's amazing. Now, if you're up for it, we have a couple viewer questions. Okay. Are you ready?
Sure.
Okay. The first one is from Bruce. How do you think Steve has remained so positive after being exposed to such horrific atrocities?
I think nothing could be as bad as what he went through. And all he can do now is put that in the past and look forward and try to take the lessons that he learned, that how important education is and so forth. His mother and father used to say education, education, education. He got this before the Holocaust, this kind of indoctrination to being educated as being the best way to get ahead.
He has 3 degrees, is that correct?
He does. He works his way through college, sleeping in a car throughout his time at BU. He literally worked his way through college, literally for many years. It wasn't like an easy 4-year school kind of thing. He pumped gasoline on the Cape. He literally lived in his car when he was going for a master's at BU, Boston University, and so forth. So he's been through it all.
Wow. Okay, this next question comes in from Jen, who asks, are you planning on circulating the film to schools? And if so, how will you go about circulating it?
Yes, actually, I would love to have this film seen in schools. One of the things I'm doing is creating an educational curriculum so that we can distribute it to schools and museums, actually. What we want to do is we'd love to get it on public television if possible and connect students with the lessons of what Steve and the film basically can tell about tolerance and perseverance and so forth, and expand that so that just people aren't sitting there watching the film and all the lessons go away. We want to be able to extrapolate and teach from the film.
Okay, and we have 2 questions, or actually I should say 1 question that 2 viewers asked, Bob and Shannon. They said, what are the most important things you hope viewers will take away from your film?
I think I go back a little bit to what I was saying about the educational materials, the lessons of determination and tolerance. I think nowadays there's a lot of intolerance. There's a lot of negativity. There are a lot of people who still have issues between the Confederate flag and shootings in the streets and police violence and other things like that. There are a lot of lessons that can be learned that are very germane to today. And so I think those are the kinds of lessons that this film can help tell.
Okay. Finishing up with a question of my own. People have used words to describe Steve, such as courageous, gutsy, a mentor, a hero, a force of nature. How do you describe Steve Ross, and how has making this film changed you?
Perseverant and hopeful, I think, are descriptions of him, and resilient. I think resilience is probably even a better term. The way he was able to bounce back after 5 horrific years and 10 concentration camps, for him to be able to endure that and then bounce back to be able to be a contributor to society and to help young people, really thousands of young people, not just because of his work in the schools, but the Holocaust Memorial. The New England Holocaust Memorial, there literally are millions of people who go through Boston every year, and they almost have to go through the memorial and learn the lessons and see the numbers etched in glass to learn the lessons of the Holocaust.
Right. And for you personally?
He's taught me to be perseverant myself,
Where can we expect to see the film once it's completed?
Well, it'll first appear on the website, steverossfilm.org.
Okay,
where
so
where
that's
there's a trailer right now.
all right. So
people
that's
can make donations.
www.steveross.org.
SunnySpeak.org.
Film. Okay.
SunnySpeak.org.
Okay.
And also the Filmmakers Collaborative. But also, I'm hoping to get it on public television and to be seen in film festivals and in schools and museums. We are trying to coordinate with several museums around the country that have, in cities where they have Holocaust museums, to create panel discussions and screenings in those cities, in those areas, possibly at those museums.
Well, I want to thank you so much for being our guest today and sharing with us this inspirational film. On behalf of myself, Roger Lyons, and all of our crew, I'd like to thank you for being with us today. We look forward to you joining us next time for another in-depth look at the inspirational lives of those living right in our midst.